Hi, welcome back. This is Dr. Sander. The last time we met, we took a look at the concept of melody. In particular, we looked at how good melodies in Orthodox church music tend to be conjunct in nature. In other words, they use stepwise motion. They tend to have an identifiable high point, or zenith, that lends direction to the line. And they tend to use motivic material to give the melody an identifiable character. Today I want to take a look at melody as well, but I want to look at melody in the sense of how it is harmonized in Orthodox church music. We often hear four-part writing and we tend to think all voices are equal and they've been composed simultaneously, but that's not entirely the case. So I want to take a look at some of the more readily identifiable melodies that we sing in the course of a church service, and to see how, in many cases, how they're harmonized. So I'd like to start off with something very simple, a litany. Now, litanies are very simple things because we sing so many of them. But this litany, perhaps, is the most simple of all. It consists of simply four notes. Lord have mercy. And of those four notes, we have only two of what we call pitch classes. Now, a pitch class is simply all of the notes that we refer to by a specific letter name. For example, all of the notes F on a piano keyboard are part of the F pitch class. So we have two pitch classes, F and E. Now, according to the rules of theory, if we were to harmonize this using regular three-note triads, we would have to use at minimum two different chords. Now, granted, we could use more than that, but at minimum, we would have to use two. So which chords would we use? Well, if you know your key signatures, and we begin and end on the note F, it would make sense that we would use an F major chord as one of those chords. But what about the E? Well, if we looked at every single triad that we could create in this key, we would find that there are only three that contain the note E. Now, which one do we use? Well, the answer is a bit complicated, as it involves what we call harmonic grammar. And harmonic grammar is something that we're going to talk about as we progress. But for right now, I don't want to think about harmonic grammar. I want to think about intervals, because when we look over time at how our notion, our understanding of harmony has developed, we see that back before we understood chords and how they related one to another, we used intervals to guide our compositional choices. So let's go back to our melody and use our understanding of intervals to begin our harmonization. Now, if you recall from a prior lecture on intervals, we categorized intervals in various ways. And one of the ways that we categorized intervals were whether they were consonant or dissonant. And what we find when we look at how our melodies in church are often harmonized, we often find that they take the melody and they add a consonant voice to that melody that moves in what we call parallel motion. Now, parallel motion is simply when the melody goes down, that voice goes down. When the melody goes up, that voice goes up. And this parallel motion we often find in one of the upper three voices, and we find it moving in either parallel thirds with the melody or parallel sixths with the melody. Now, if this melody were in the alto, most often we find that it's the soprano that will be the parallel voice, moving in thirds with this melody. Lord have mercy. Now that may sound good to our ears, it certainly is consonant, but over the course of an hour or two, it may sound a little bit boring. It's almost like we're looking at a cake and only tasting the frosting, and no cake. So what's missing? What's missing is the foundation of the harmony, and in many cases, the root of this chord. So when we add the root and the foundation of this harmony, it fills out the sound. And you guessed it, we find this foundation most often in the bass voice. See, guys, you are important after all. You may not sing melodies, but you give us the foundation of our harmony. So, if we take these upper parallel thirds and we add a bass note to it, we get a much richer, much fuller sound. So now we have something that sounds pretty familiar to our ears. In fact, you could probably sing the whole service with just these three voices and make it sound pretty good. So what does the fourth voice do? Well, if you've ever sung tenor or alto for any length of time, you will know that you don't always get to sing all of the interesting melodies. In fact, there are times when you're just singing one or two notes. But these one or two notes are important. We often refer to this fourth voice as a filler voice, not because it's unimportant, but because it fills out the rest of the chord. It enriches the chord and provides a fuller, more robust sound. So instead of this, we add the tenor voice on the note C. And you can see this voice is not very interesting, but its impact on the overall harmony is significant. So let's just summarize briefly what we've talked about. Remember, what I'm giving you here is not rules of harmonic grammar. What I'm describing here is a very basic formula for harmonizing melody that we find in much of our Orthodox church music. So we have basically a pre-existing melody. Two, we have a voice that accompanies that melody in either parallel thirds or in parallel sixths, depending on where that melody is in the voice. And then we have a bass voice that provides the root of each chord, a foundation, a harmonic foundation. And then we have a fourth voice, which either doubles the root of the chord or provides notes that are missing from the other three to complete the chord. So if you can identify these things in some of the hymns that you're singing, it provides you a certain amount of flexibility. So I'm going to show you a way that you can take this formula and alter it to accommodate the singers that you have available. So let's begin by looking at a cherubic hymn, a very commonly sung cherubic hymn, known as the so-called Greek chant cherubic hymn, and you probably know this melody. Now you notice that this melody adheres to many of the things that we talked about in the last lesson. The idea that good melodic lines should be primarily conjunct in motion and should have a high focal point. And I think that's partly why this melody and this cherubic hymn is so popular. So now when we put it into its four-part context, we can see some of these principles in action. So I'm going to mark each of these voices with a specific color. You can see right now this voice, the melodic voice, I've highlighted, is in the alto section, but we're going to go ahead and leave that entirely in black notes. Now, the second voice, we know, is a voice that moves in parallel motion, either in thirds or sixths, and we can see that here marked in purple in the soprano voice. And these two voices together pretty much outline the melody and its parallel harmony. And again, you can hear that this is pretty, but maybe a little boring. So now we add the bass, and I'm going to mark that in red, and I've actually put down the numbers of the scale degree in which the bass is singing, so that we can keep track of that as well. And you'll see that if you did an analysis of this particular setting, you would find that in most of these, the bass is singing the root of the triad, with an exception here and there. And finally, the filler voice, or the voice that's not particularly a pleasing melody, but necessary, is in the tenor voice, and we're going to go ahead and mark this green. Now when we play through this melody in all four voices, you can see the effect of this harmonization that we've applied to this melody. So why is all of this important? We already said that it's not really going to enable us to take any given melody and harmonize it, because we lack some of the rules of harmonic grammar. But what it does enable us to do is to apply a purpose or a functionality for every single voice. Let's take another example, and I'll show how this might be helpful in a situation in your parish. Okay, here we have a very well-known melody. This is the Troparian melody, tone 1, which we sing for many of our great feasts like Theophany, Dormition, and others. Also, we sing this commonly for antiphons, first, second, and maybe sometimes even the third antiphon in liturgy. So let's say that we have a weekday liturgy and not many singers available to us. I know, hard to imagine, but it might happen sometime. Let's say that we only have an alto, a tenor, and a bass. So when we look at the actual score, I've color-coded it here. We can see the various parts like the melody, marked in black, and the soprano. The parallel voice moving in sixth with the melody, marked in purple here in the tenor. And finally, the filler voice, marked in green in the alto. Here's what it sounds like when we put it all together. So here's the problem. We only have 3 singers, an alto, a tenor, and of course the bass. But the problem here is that the melody is in the soprano line. So what if we just had each singer sing his or her own regular part? What would it sound like? Well, unfortunately, I think you'll agree that the sound is missing something. So the problem is, we have all harmony and no melody. You've got to have the melody. Well, we could give it to the altos, but it lies at a higher register, and over the course of a service, she might get kind of tired of singing in that register. So what about this? What if we were to give the soprano line, the melody, to the tenor an octave lower? And then we had the alto sing the tenor line, the parallel voice. I think you'll agree that that sounds a whole lot better. But there's one thing that we just might want to do. You'll notice that both the tenor and the alto voices are singing in the lowest part of their range. Now, while these notes are certainly possible, because they're so low, the overall sound will lack a certain amount of presence. So as a final step, we may consider transposing this up a whole step. Certainly possible for the bass, since it's right in the middle of their register, and it would make the tenor and the alto voices sound a little bit clearer to our ears. Here's what the final product sounds like. So I think you could see how a working knowledge of this kind of chant harmonization can be very beneficial and practical. Now, we're not giving you the tools to go out and be able to compose chant harmonizations. That's a more advanced concept, and it's something that would take time to develop. But knowing the functionality of each voice within this kind of harmonization, so I'm afraid that's all the time we have to adjust based on
This is
singing
Dr. Kurt
resources
Sander,
that you have.
and may God,
And
who
it gives
uses
you
the beauty
a better
of this world to
understanding
draw
of
us
what each
closer to
voice is
Him,
doing. Bless and keep you all until next time.